Hello there and welcome. It's Juliana Michaels, and in this video I'm sharing a fun way to use distress embossing glaze to color your stamped images. The beauty of embossing glaze is its transparent nature. Because it's transparent, you can layer images below it and still see them, and this makes it perfect for this coloring technique. If you're looking for more inspiration and ways to use embossing glazes, make sure to check out my 9 amazing distress embossing glaze techniques video. You can find a link to that in the description box below or via the link in the upper right hand corner of this video. As always, I encourage you to use products that you already have in your craft room. However, if you're interested in any of the products I'm using in this video, you can find the supply list with links in the description box below. Just click on the word more to see more. When you shop through those links, you're supporting me at no extra cost to you, and I really appreciate that so very much. If you haven't heard the news, Tim Holtz has added 6 new colors of embossing glaze to the embossing glaze palette. And the colors that he's added are Tumbled Glass, Shaded Lilac, Frayed Burlap, Mustard Seed, Evergreen Bough, and Dried Marigold. And as you can see here, I have swatched each of the colors onto the lids of each of the jars. To create these, I just die cut circles from white cardstock, and then I apply embossing ink to the paper, so just directly to the paper. And then I gently pick it up by the edges, pour the embossing glaze powder over that ink. The powder then sticks to that ink, and then I just heat it with my heat embossing gun. And then to adhere the swatch to the jars, I just use some collage medium, and then I just put a little weight on top of this while it's drying, and then it's ready to go. And I love that I have these on a drawer, and I really love that I can open the drawer and look in there easily and see what color I want, and I can grab it and go. So for the project today, I'm going to be using these new embossing glaze colors, and then I'm also going to be working with some distress embossing pens, and they come in different tips. So there's a bullet tip that's a little bit more like detailed and smaller, and then there's also a brush tip that just lets you color a little bit larger areas if you like. And these embossing pens are basically just markers that have embossing ink in them, just like an embossing ink pad would have, and you can use this to color. Along with the new embossing glaze colors, I'm going to be working with some other products, so I'm going to go over that with you here. I'm going to be using peeled paint distress embossing glaze, but you could use any color. I just wanted a green to use. I'm also going to be working with the distress embossing pens. So there's a bullet pen and a brush pen, so the tips are just slightly different on each of those, but they are markers that have an embossing ink in them. I'm also going to be using an embossing ink pad. I'm going to be doing the stamping with archival ink and black soot, so just some sort of permanent ink. The distress inks I'm going to be using are old paper, vintage photo, mustard seed, dried marigold, and then I also have oxide inks and evergreen bough and dried marigold. And these could all be kind of switched in and out with oxides or regular distress ink depending on what you have. And then I'll be using a sticker from this for the sentiment on my card. And then the stencil I'll be using is this little halftone stencil that's from the mini set. And the stamp sets I'll be using for like the focal point on my cards is the Botanic Collage and Floral Trims. And I selected these because I have the coordinating dies that go with them. And these are only available at Simon Says Stamp. They have created coordinating dies for some of Tim's more popular stamp sets, and so I will be using those. If you're interested, the envelopes that I have these in are the Hero Arts large envelopes. So I'll have all of these supplies, of course, so linked in my description box below the video. And then some of the other stamps I'll be using just to add a little interest to the background. I'm going to use this little splatter stamp from Tiny Toadstools, this text piece here from Flower Shop, and then this ledger stamp from etc. So again, with any of these stamps, feel free to use different stamps from your stash. For this, you don't necessarily need to use any of these. And then as far as colors go, of course, if you've got other colors of embossing glaze, you know, just pick some inks that coordinate. That's kind of what I did here, was just, you know, the mustard seed and dried marigold and evergreen bough are some of the new colors that are in the new embossing glaze collection. And then as far as the paper goes, I'm going to be working with just a plain white smooth cardstock, and which is a little different for me. I normally always work with distressed watercolor cardstock, but I thought I'd challenge myself a little bit to see if I could craft without it today. So we're going to give that a try and see how it goes. Off camera, I have stamped these images using archival ink and black soot. I've just stamped onto pieces of smooth white cardstock. So this one I just stamped once, and then this one I stamped twice, and that's because the die for this only cuts out that flower part, and I'm going to die cut that part and then layer it on top of this piece to kind of make our finished card design. So you'll kind of see that as I get into the making here. So now we are going to do some coloring with embossing powders. So it'll be a little bit of a slow-ish process, but I think in the end the finished effect is going to be really cool. So now we're just going to color in the image here using the embossing pen, and you just want to make sure you get a good amount of ink over the surface here, and kind of use the fine tip one to kind of do the outside edges. And then I like to use this larger one then to go and kind of fill in the larger areas, just so it doesn't take quite as long to get the ink on there. And then I'm going to place that over a piece of printer paper, and I'm going to take the Evergreen Bough Embossing Glaze and pour that over there. And you can see that the powder sticks to the area where we applied the ink. And if you get a little bit off, you know, where it's maybe over the edge and you don't want it there, you can just use a small little brush to wipe that away if you like. And then if you miss a spot, you can add more ink after you heat set this, and then put a little more powder on and redo this whole little next step here. So we're going to put that powder, excess powder, back into the jar. And then now I'm just going to use my heat embossing gun to heat set this. So once you turn the heat gun on, you just want to give it a few seconds to kind of warm up, and then you're just going to move it over the paper, directing the heat down towards the powder, and it will slowly melt it. And you just kind of want to keep it moving slowly, not holding it in one place for too long so that it doesn't burn your paper or over melt the powder. So now I'm going to show you how that goes. And once you see that the powder is melting and getting shiny, then you just want to kind of move on to the next section, because you don't need to keep reheating it. And there is our first step in the coloring. So now we're going to move on to the leaves, and you're just going to color those in. And you can kind of decide how many, like how much area you feel like you can kind of do. And then you know, maybe you'll come back then and add more ink, just so that the ink doesn't get dried out on you and then the powder won't stick. So you want to make sure that ink is still wet. And this is peeled paint. And while not one of the new colors, it's one of my favorites. And so you can see we've got that section filled in, and if you want, you could just add the powder, add more ink here. And just keep repeating that until you get everything colored in. And if at any time you want to stop and just heat set that, you know, just move your powder out of the way and heat set that with your heat gun. And then, like I mentioned, if there's any little areas that maybe you missed and you want to add a little bit more color to that, just go back over it with your pen. And so there is a look at our color stamped image. And of course, like if you wanted to get even more into the coloring and you wanted to mix and do like some lighter, darker greens, you could put, you know, sprinkle a little bit on with your hands even. And then with this, now we're just gonna die cut this using the coordinating dies. So here is the die cut image. And then as you can see, where I have that double stamped, then we can just pop that up over that other image just to add a little bit more depth and interest. Now again, if you didn't want to do this, you could also certainly do this coloring on that paper like we did and just leave it like that. So definitely have some options. Now I'm going to do that same process coloring this larger image, and for this one I'm going to use the dried marigold mustard seed and then maybe the peel paint, but then I might even use the Evergreen Bough for the petals or for the leaves. I think that could be kind of pretty too. So I'm going to start off with the centers because they're just so kind of tiny and small that I feel like I need to get those colored in here first. And that's where this kind of smaller pen size comes in really handy. And we're going to put the mustard seed on the flower centers. And then, you know, if you happen to get like some powder in some other areas that you don't want it, like I mentioned earlier, just take a little brush and brush that off so you don't heat emboss that onto the area that you don't want it. And then just use your heat gun to heat set that. And if you're getting like the powder all over your desk, you can use like a little Swiffer and just kind of help wipe that off. It's just an easy way to clean that powder up. Now I'm just going to move on to these larger flower areas. And this here I'm going to use the dried marigold. And as you can see, I've definitely got some areas there that I'm going to need to go back and add some ink to. So I think I'm going to color around the edge of this one with this smaller pen first. Again, definitely missed some spots. So I'm going to heat set this and we'll add those in. Now, if you want to leave some of this space not colored in to kind of give it more of like a painterly effect, you could certainly do that. Or you could, you know, really make sure you cover all the areas. Kind of up to you there. I think it gives it a really just kind of cool effect with it not completely colored in. So yeah, definitely something you could play around with and figure out what you like. It's funny where you've got more like a smaller detail, you might want to grab that smaller bullet tip to apply the ink and then come back with this one. And my tip is kind of bent a little bit, as you can see. It might just be, I've had these for quite some time and used them quite a bit in the past, and so it's probably a little bit worn out. So a new one might not be quite so bendy. And again, if you ever just get any powder where you don't want it, just take your brush and wipe it off. Now what I'll do is just going to go in here and do these leaves. I think I'm going to get bold here and try the Evergreen Bough on these and see how that looks. Ooh, yeah, that looks pretty. And I'm also really kind of liking the not fully inked areas. Like, I think that gives it a much more hand-drawn looking or hand-painted look. And I don't know if you've noticed, as we're going along here, with regular embossing powder, we would not be able to see the stamped image under here. We would be losing that because they are opaque. Embossing glaze, that is kind of the beauty of it, they are translucent, so you can see through them, and that is what it's allowing us to be able to do this beautiful coloring. So here's a look at this finished image once we've added all the color. And now, again, it's time to die cut this image as well. Or if you wanted to just stamp this straight onto your card background, you could do that as well. And then, you know, just cut it down to whatever size that you want. For the background on this card, I'm going to be working with this Stress ink in mustard seed, dried marigold, and old paper. And I'm just going to ink smush some of these colors onto my craft mat here. Just a little bit of that yellow. And we'll give it a good spritz with some water. And then I'm just going to kind of dab into these inks a little bit here and there. And I don't really want too many of those little speckledy drops, so I'm just going to give that a little dry. And I'm going to, a little bit of that yellow on here. And now we're going to add in some of that dried marigold. And get a little water. And give that a dry. And just kind of tilt the paper around, and if there's kind of that ink running to the edges, because the paper's going to curl when it gets wet. That's just the nature of the beast. But once it's dry, it'll flatten back out. And I'm working on a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock here, so I definitely recommend using some sort of watercolor paper or paper that can handle wet mediums for this part of the process. And I just want a real light wash of color here, because I don't want anything that's going to be too dark to compete against my embellishment that we created. Now I'm just going to take a little paper towel and just kind of dab dry some of the areas that are still a little bit wet. And then you can finish drying that completely if you like. Next up, we're going to take this stencil here, and this is the halftone stencil from the mini set. I'll have that linked in the description box down below the video, so just make sure you check that out if you're looking for this stencil. And I'm just going to take some dried marigold and distress oxide now. We're just going to add just a little bit of interest to the background with this. Just a little bit of color. And then I'm going to do kind of the same thing over here. There we go. You could also use the regular distress ink for that as well if you'd like, so kind of really up to you there. And now, before you continue on to the next step, you definitely want to make sure this is completely dry. So either use your heat tool to let it dry or let it sit for a little while and dry that way. But either way, just want to make sure it's completely dry. All right, and now we're going to do a little bit of some more stamping, and this time I'm going to grab a few different stamps. I was looking for ones that kind of had some text on them. So I've got this one here from the Flower Shop stamp set, and then I grabbed this one, I think maybe this Ledger stamp from the Etc. stamp set. And I'm going to use my stamping platform for this. I'm going to stamp these with my embossing ink pad. Take the Frayed Burlap embossing powder. I'm going to sprinkle that over this. So what will happen is if this paper isn't dry, that ink from the stenciling isn't dry, the powder is going to stick to that ink. So you would end up with that design with ink all over it. So again, just kind of make sure that that's dry. And then we're just going to heat emboss this. And then stamp a little this image here. And because the focal point here is going to cover up most of that, I'm not going to ink the whole stamp. So I'm just going to put a little ink on this one side here. And then do that frayed burlap again. And then we'll heat emboss that as well. So there is kind of a look at the card. So what I'm going to do is, once I get this adhered on here, I'll just trim off some of that overhanging image. And then finish this off by adding a sentiment and then matting it onto another piece of cardstock. Well, I feel like it still needs a little something, don't you? Maybe those little blue dots. I think that's what's throwing me off. What we're going to do. So, yeah. This is one of those videos you're getting me working through it while I'm recording, so that's what we're gonna do here. Kind of think about that, and then I'm gonna use this little splatter stamp that is from Toadstool stamp set. I'm just gonna add some little splatters here and there. And then for this, because I'm going to kind of repeat stamp with this, I'm going to use a stamping block, but again I'm going to use the embossing ink here. this up. And I'm going to add some of the Tumbled glass embossing glaze. Just kind of brushing off any of that extra embossing glaze there that I don't want. Pour this back in the jar. And then we're just going to heat emboss that. And yeah, that is definitely more what I'm looking for. And another little trick I'm going to share with you. So with this background, it's not white, and then so this edging of this, I don't mind the white outline, but some of these more open spots in here. So I'm going to take a little bit of old paper and a water brush. So it's just could be a paintbrush with water, and I'm going to kind of wash in a little color into those spaces. Just very lightly though, because we did not use watercolor paper here, so it's not going to take water very well. Just kind of keep that in mind, which kind of happened right there. So hopefully once that dries, it won't be quite so noticeable. And then we layer it on there, and it's not quite so bam in your face with all the white. So just a little tip to share with you. I get so used to only working on watercolor cardstock and being able to like go back and do that sort of thing when I think about it, or wish I had done it. So yeah, old habits die hard sometimes. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add a little vintage photo ink to the edges here, and I kind of, as you saw when I came onto there, it went kind of dark on me, or a little darker than I wanted, so I went back off and rubbed some of that ink off onto my craft mat, and then I can pull it on and it won't be quite as dark. Kind of blend that out a little bit here. Just want a little bit of a color on around the edge, because you know me, I like to ink the edges. And then, you know, if you wanted, you could also ink the edges of this. I'm kind of torn about doing that or not, but this little section is going to get cut off, so let's maybe just ink that and kind of see if I like the way that looks, and I kind of do. So I'm going to grab a little smaller blending brush here and just ink the edges of this a little bit. And if you are like, oh no, I don't like that, then skip this part for sure. Okay. And I can kind of ink in the centers a little bit as well. Because remember, the embossing glaze, nothing's going to stick to it because that's a smooth surface. So any ink that you put on that, it's not going to do anything to color it at all. So there we go. And like I said, I'm just going to finish that off with matting it onto another piece of paper and then adding a sentiment. So here I've cut down the white cardstock, and I also cut a piece of black cardstock down to like 3 1/4 by 5 inches. And I'm just going to mat that. So I'll be trimming this other paper down just to mat slightly smaller than that black card. and then I'm going to tear along this edge here. And you're just going to pull that paper towards you, and that will just kind of give you that rough edge as you tear. And then that's just going to layer onto that black cardstock piece. And this card was greatly inspired by a card that I created at Simon Says Create back in the spring that was in the Ranger booth. And I've just always loved the card and have been wanting to recreate something similar. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. So I'm going to take this white strip, just a piece of smooth white cardstock, and I'm going to stamp this ledger image from the Etc. stamp set. And I'm going to use my stamping platform again here, and then just position it in here, and then line that up just so that kind of part of it's on that strip. And then I'm going to ink that up with some of the embossing ink that I've been using. And then now I'm just going to add some of the Frayed Burlap embossing powder. So just going to sprinkle that over the paper here, tap off the excess. And a little extra there, so I'm just going to brush that off with the little paintbrush. And now I'm just going to heat emboss that with my heat gun. And then I'm just going to repeat that entire process and stamp on the lower half of that paper and emboss it as well. And now that we've got that little strip embossed, I'm going to ink the edges of both of these pieces with some Vintage Photo Distress ink. And just using my blending brush here to apply the ink along the edges. You could certainly use Distress Oxide ink for this if you like. And then I'm just going to layer the colored die cut that we created earlier onto this, and I think I'm going to ink the edges of that as well. So I'm just going to use some of that leftover ink here from my blending brush and ink that up. And then I've already adhered some double-sided foam adhesive to the back of this, and I'm just going to adhere that and line it up with that stamped image below. And now I'm just going to start kind of assembling the card, just going to adhere these two layers together here. And now I'm going to take some twine, like jute twine, and wrap that around this piece a couple times and just tie a little bow, just to add a little bit of interest. This is something that I always like doing, just don't think to do it very often, and I like the texture that it adds, especially with the jute. And use my scissors, trim off that excess, and it's ready to go. Now I'm just going to ink up the edges of that strip that I stamped with the embossing. So now we're going to take a piece of just white cardstock, and because I'm going to kind of layer these onto here, kind of create my design, I want to take a little bit of this Evergreen Bough oxide, and I'm going to add some color to this one edge here. In a way, I'm kind of creating my own custom colored cardstock, a little strip of it here. And so that's going to go along that edge there. And then this will layer on top of that. And clean up this little mess here. And now I'm going to take my stencil and just do a little light stencil work. I don't want it super dark, so I'm going to kind of wipe some of that off onto my craft mat there. And I'm just going to add a little bit of color to this corner here. Just real light. There we go. I'm going to slide it down. I'm going to do the same thing. This bottom corner here. I'm going to wipe off some of that excess and then just add a little bit down here. And I don't want to overlap what I've already done, so I just raise that stencil up a little bit and just kind of peek and see where things are meeting up there. And from here, you can kind of see, wouldn't mind just a little bit kind of right on all those corners there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this stencil here, just add a little bit there. I'm going to do the same thing down here. Well, that's all kind of covered up because of this. So let's put this back down and line that back up here again. Find where I had it lined up. That's always the trick. There we go. I'm just going to do a little bit more here. There we go. Do the same thing down here. There we go. Okay, perfect. And then just to finish that off, I'm going to take a little bit of vintage photo and just lightly rub it along the edge here with my blending brush. Just add a little bit of distress, but not a ton. And we'll adhere all of our pieces and the card will be finished. Here's a look at the completed cards I created using this coloring with embossing glaze technique. It's really quite simple, but it's a fun new way to add color and interest to your card designs. I'd love to know if you've ever used embossing glazes or even regular embossing powder to add color to your stamped images. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.